So last time we discussed at length the first of our two presentations on the interwar years in Soviet Ukraine. I discussed what we can look at throughout the whole interwar years as three phases, and we looked primarily at, last time, the first phase, with one exception, the economic. We'll get to that in a moment. And we end that first thing with the year 1928, which, as you can see on this brief outline on the board, we define as a period of transition. Now, the changes that were to begin to take place in Soviet Ukraine about 1928 actually reflected a general shift in governmental policy throughout the Soviet Union. And these changes have generally been referred to as Stalinism or the Stalinist Revolution. Stalinism, the Stalinist Revolution, named, of course, after Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary of the All-Soviet Communist Party. These changes that he introduced in 1928 were basically in the Soviet economy. Although that inevitably also had profound implications in the political, national, and cultural spheres as well. It is, after all, through economic transformation that Marxist-Leninist ideologists promised to create an egalitarian society in which both the means of production and the results of that production would be owned, allegedly controlled, by the working classes that in the first place made such production possible. In that context, we need now to look back a little bit to that first period. Already in June 1918, about just half the years after the, not even a half a year after the Bolsheviks came to power, an attempt was made to transform Russian society, or at least those areas of the old Tsarist empire controlled by the Bolsheviks, because the Civil War was already on and the Bolsheviks didn't control the whole country. In any case, those areas where they did have some control, to transform those areas into the classless communist ideal. What did this mean? All industries were nationalized, in other words, taken over by the state, run by paid technical experts, responding to the central government's directives from Moscow. This applied to small-scale as well as large-scale industries, to transportation, communication facilities, to rural areas where the large landed estates were to be preserved, but this time in the form of state-owned farms and collectives. In some cases, the use of money was even prohibited, and instead barter relations were used among industries and between industry and agricultural sector. Money, of course, was the ultimate symbol of the hated capitalist world. This approach to the economy was known as war communism. War communism. The results: catastrophic. leading to the almost complete paralysis in the industrial sector, to an increase in inflation, to peasant disturbances in reaction to forced grain requisitioning and state appropriation of the land. Bolshevik Party members meeting in 1921 realized that the war communism approach had failed. Ever the pragmatist, Lenin decided to make what he called a strategic retreat in the revolution. Now, this did not mean that total nationalization of industry or communalization of the land was abandoned as the ultimate goal. Rather, that goal just had to be put off for a while until the new Soviet society would be ready. And so Lenin's famous dictum, one step backward, eventually to make 2 steps forward, was now being implemented. The 1 step backward, if you will, was a repudiation of war communism and a return to a semi-market-driven economy that came to be known as the New Economic Policy. The New Economic Policy, also known by its acronym NEP. This new economic policy, heralded in 1921 with an end to the forced grain requisitioning from the peasantry, and instead with the institution of a tax in kind that specified the amount of produce that each peasant had to contribute to the state. Soon after, other measures followed that permitted the peasants to dispose of their surplus produce freely. And that allowed the development now of a thriving local agricultural market and trade. Also, small-scale industries were denationalized, resulting in the rise of a new class of small businessmen. They came to be called as the NEP men. That is, the businessmen of the new economic policy, the NEP men. This new economic policy, which was to function from 1921 until 1928, it was described as state capitalism. The policy was to place the Soviet economy back on the road to recovery, so that by the mid-1920s, that economy had at least reached production levels that had existed in the Russian Empire in the last year of 1913, before World War I. This allowance of a relatively free local agrarian markets and the reintroduction of capitalism in the small-scale industrial sector, therefore competitions, free trade, fluctuating prices, even some unemployment, which of course could never happen in a socialist state. All of this also made possible the recovery of the economy in Ukraine. By 1927, the gross national product of Ukraine was 99.5% what it had been in 1913. So clearly a success. However, the new economic policy was never more than a temporary measure to get the Soviet economy disrupted since 1914, first by World War I, then the Civil War, then the misguided extremes of this war. Communism was just meant to get it back on its feet. Now that Lenin's proverbial one step backward had yielded positive results, it seemed time to move on and take those 2 steps forward. Lenin wasn't around to do this because he died in 1924. That task was left to his successor, Joseph Stalin. And now we arrive at this transition phase. As for the economic sphere, Stalin introduced in 1928 the concept of a command economy. Command economy. This meant that all decisions were to be made in the center of political power, Moscow, and implemented throughout the entire Soviet Union, which was now treated as a single economic unit. The introduction of this command economy, supposedly a comprehensive, more rational approach to economic development, meant the immediate end to the new economic policy. And in its stead, the first of the so-called 5-year plans was introduced. So now we have the command economy and 5-year plans. The first of them set goals for all aspects of Soviet agriculture, and most especially for its industry. Production schedules and goals were set for each aspect of the economy, and those goals were to be fulfilled at the end of the 5-year period. This new approach not only spelled the end of the new economic policy, it also meant the end to whatever individual prerogatives the various republics of this Soviet Union may have still had over their economies according to the initial 1924 Soviet Constitution. Now the entire country is being treated as one whole. And with the introduction of the command economy, central planning became the new slogan of the Communist Revolution. And already in 1927, a state planning commission, short in Russian known as the GOSPLAN, Государственный план, the GOSPLAN, State Planning Commission, it was established to oversee the economy in general and certainly the implementation of the 5-year plans, which in fact this State Planning Commission put together. Now, the overall goals of this first 5-year plan were to nationalize all sectors of the economy, regardless of size. And that meant small-scale industries, service industries, as well as collectivization of the agricultural sector. And all in all, it was clearly an ambitious goal. And considering the generally still underdeveloped state of the Soviet economy and the ingrained traditional habits of its citizens, it would require leadership of unbending purpose, which would be willing to carry out the task, whatever the cost. And indeed, the cost was great. So, if we're looking at these first 5-year plans, we have one from 1928 to 1932, 1933 to 1937, and 1938 to 1941. The 5-year plan was cut short because of World War II. That is the third one. Each of these plans had different goals in mind, or emphases, if you will. And so during the first one, specifically for now, the 5-year plans for Ukraine, during the first one, Ukraine was to be transformed into the Soviet Union's leading industrial center for coal extraction, metallurgy, as well as its primary agricultural source for grains, sugar, fats. The second one put an emphasis on possibly the complete technological reconstruction of industry and expansion of the transportation system, and emphasis on agriculture. And the third one put greater emphasis on chemical and machine building industries. Now, as a result of these plans, Ukraine, which for centuries had been based on an agricultural economy, was now transformed into a modern industrialized society. The infrastructure for heavy industrial development already begun in 1926-27 with the establishment of enormous electrical power plants in various parts of the country. The transportation system that I've alluded to also expanded, nearly 4,000 kilometers of new railroad track being laid. Industrial production as a whole increased by more than 5.5 times between 1928 and 1937 during those first 2 5-year plans. And as for each of the industrial categories within heavy industry, the most remarkable increases were made in the production of mineral fertilizers, 17 times increase between 1928 and 1940. Other large increases in the production of industrial timber, cement, iron ore, pig iron. In the agricultural sector, Stalin's revolution from above and the introduction of this first 5-year plan in 1928 meant an end to the relatively free market system that prevailed in the Ukrainian countryside during the period of the new economic policy in the 20s. The one step backward of NEP was to be replaced by, now in Stalin's term, a giant leap forward. And this giant leap took the form of collectivization. The theoretical justification, because every act of a ideologically Marxist-Leninist driven society has to be justified, and the justification for collectivization was that it would correct the shortcomings of the new economic policy. We should remember that collectivization was actually never given up as an ideal, even during the NEP period, the period of the new economic policy, although at that time it depended solely on voluntary action. And because of this, by October 1928, less than 4% of Ukrainian agriculture was collectivized. And now faced with this situation and the unlikelihood that the peasants would voluntarily give up their land, a policy of forced collectivization was decreed throughout the Soviet Union in March 1929. Forced collectivization. No, pardon, again. Introduced in November 1929. So this policy of forced collectivization decreed throughout the Soviet Union, very specifically on November 17, 1929. The program was intended to be swift, and in Ukraine already by March 1930, allegedly 70% of the land was collectivized. Although the process was difficult, and at times is even slowed down deliberately by the central authorities, by Stalin himself, nonetheless, by October 1935, just past the first five-year plan, 98% of all Ukrainian lands were collectivized by October 1935. On those agricultural arable lands, two basic entities came into existence, state farms and collective farms. State farms and collective farms. In order to provide the state farms, obviously owned by the state and run by the state, both them, as well as the collective farms, with farm machinery, because you're going to collectivize, you're modernizing agriculture, you needed machinery. So tractors now became the symbolic solution to all agricultural problems, and specifically places called machine and tractor stations were established throughout the countryside. Each of them had between 30 and 60 tractors and other farm machinery, so no one owned their own machinery because no one owned anything. You would go, the collective farm or the state farm would go to the machine and tractor stations, sign out a tractor, I guess somewhat similar to now you can do this with bicycles on the streets of Toronto, and probably if any of you do that even with a small bicycle, you know what happens to it when it gets used too long or no one maintains it. So you can imagine now we have state farms and collective farms tapping into tractors. What, at least in terms of agricultural production, were the results of this rapid change to collectivization between 1939 and 1935? There are statistics from 1940, the end of the period, and of course 1913, the last year before the war, so we have some sense of comparison or evolution during this period. And with that kind of comparison, we see that there was actually a decrease in the production of food grains, wheat, rye, corn, barley, oats, etc., buckwheat. A decrease. So in 1913, producing 24 million hectares. In 1940, only 21 million. On the other hand, the overall decrease in food grains was matched by a more than 2.5 times increase in industrial and livestock crops. So things like sugar beets, flax, hemp, sunflower, cotton, tobacco. And on the one hand, we can sum up all of this kind of period and the statistical data, which I've only skimmed on, by saying that the collectivization of Ukraine's agriculture was in fact completed during the 1930s. And there were some advances in terms of productivity, as I've just said, especially in industrial crops. But at what cost? there is, after all, a human element. And in the case of agriculture, Ukrainian peasant farmers, and for that matter, Russian and other peasant farmers in the Soviet Union, did not look with favor on the prospect of having to give up what was almost a mystical part of themselves, the land. But plans for the greater good of society, a socialist or communist society, were being made in Moscow, and the mystical tie between the peasant and his land would have to be broken. And if that tie could not be broken, then in the interests of the greater good of society, and that included, of course, fulfillment of the plan, recalcitrant peasants would have to be liquidated. And on this score, theory became practice. Marxism-Leninism had always preached class warfare as part of the dialectic of history. Class warfare would then lead inevitably to the world socialist revolution. And so class war now became part of the Soviet drive toward collectivization. Well-to-do peasants, the so-called kulaks, Ukrainian kurkuli, but almost always one uses the term kulaks. These well-to-do peasant kulaks were declared enemies of the people because they were generally opposed to collectivization. Now, initially, a kulak was defined as anyone having more than 24 acres of land and employing laborers. Actually, in most cases, those laborers were no more than one, and it could be the wife of the peasant, but already an employer. And according to this definition, in 1926, kulaks accounted for between 3 and 4% of all peasant households in Ukraine. Beginning already in 1927, the kulaks were made to pay heavy taxes, and the following year, 1928, they were deprived of their franchise, the right to vote, which was a big deal in the Soviet Union. Finally, in January 1930, the Central Committee of the All-Soviet Communist Party in Moscow ordered, quote-unquote, the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. The liquidation of the kulaks as a class. They were simply physically picked up, men first, women and children later, and shipped off to Central Asia, Siberia, Soviet Far East, many dying along the way. By March 1930, nearly 62,000 households, an estimated 250,000 people, had been removed from Soviet Ukraine during a policy known as dekulakization. Dekulakization. Now, although the kulaks were eliminated basically in 1930, there was still the mass of the peasantry. What to do with them? The years 1931 and 1932 were marked by relatively widespread peasant resistance to collectivization, took the form of refusing to deliver grain to the collective and to the state farms. And in the midst of this situation, there was a severe drought that produced a poor harvest in 1931. And so unfavorable climatic conditions, accompanied by requisitioning of grain and artificial class warfare between urban officials, the army, and poor peasants on the one hand, and all opponents of collectivization and forced requisition on the other. And now everybody who, the kulaks were gone, but the people who were still there and opposed collectivization, now they're called kulaks as well. So a kulak could become anybody who was opposed to Soviet policy. Well, all of this left the Ukrainian countryside in dire straits, meaning that by the winter of 1932, the country was bereft of food supplies. The result, by the spring of 1933, was widespread famine. For its part, Soviet officials in Moscow were convinced that the peasants were simply hiding grain. And therefore, the government refused to recognize this catastrophe and provided no assistance. Put another way, a famine, and known in now the Ukrainian world and elsewhere as the Holodomor, from the Soviet official perspective, a famine never occurred, making it impossible to know with even relative accuracy the exact cost in human lives. There's equally much disagreement as to the cause of this Holodomor, this great famine. Was it the result of bureaucratic bungling during the collectivization campaign? Was it part of an explicit policy against recalcitrant peasants, regardless of their nationality? Was it an attempt to liquidate nationalist opposition in all areas deemed critical to the Soviet Union? For instance, the famine did occur in the Don Cossack lands just to the east of Ukraine in the North Caucasus region, as well as the German-inhabited Middle Volga regions, in Kazakhstan as well, but it took a different form. Or was it directed specifically against ethnic Ukrainians, therefore as an act of genocide? Now, satisfactory answers to questions of causation continue to be discussed, debated. But on one thing, there is agreement among scholars and analysts of this problem, and that agreement is several million deaths did occur in Soviet Ukraine during 1933. Among the more conservative estimates of famine victims, either from starvation or diseases related to malnutrition, about 4.8 million people. Using this relatively conservative estimate, representing 15% of the Ukrainian population at the time, translates into the following gruesome statistics. During the spring and summer of that fateful year of 1933, 25,000 people died every day, meaning 1,000 every hour or 17 every minute. Now, the enormous changes introduced throughout the Soviet Union after 1928 in the socioeconomic sphere undoubtedly were to have an impact on cultural and national life as well. These changes, as they pertain to Ukrainian cultural life, were already heralded in late 1926 and early 1927 with the denunciation of Khvylovyi's theories on Ukrainian literature and the removal of this Shumskyi, Oleksandr Shumskyi, from the post of Commissar of Education. We discussed those two figures last time, Khvylovyi and Shumskyi, the ultimate representatives of full-scale Ukrainianization. Now, while in 1928 the policy of Ukrainianization was still officially supported by the Communist Party Bolshevik of Ukraine, I told you last time there was always this debate within the party about Ukrainianization, good thing, bad thing. But after 1928, the kind of internationalist core of the Ukrainian party, the Communist Party Bolshevik, now made or pretended that its main concern was the protection of national minorities in Ukraine that are somehow being discriminated against as a result of Ukrainianization. And that included then calls for maintenance of Russian as the dominant element in urban and industrial areas. And that included the Russification of incoming ethnic Ukrainians from the countryside, and also for a general limitation on the Ukrainianization program. Of course, these internationalists, they would argue, why be concerned with the cultural welfare of specific national groups, since Marxist-Leninist ideology ultimately foresaw the withering away of states and, in particular, of nationality distinctions. So if that eventually is going to happen, what are we worried about? And it's within this new environment that the defense of Ukrainianization fell on the former moderate, at least on this issue of Ukrainianization, Mykola Skripnik. This was this Mykola Skripnik that we discussed last time, who replaced Shumskyi as Commissar of Education when he was dismissed in 1927. Skripnik called for more investments in Soviet Ukraine from the central budget. He defended Ukrainian cultural activists like that writer Khvylovyi from further attacks, and he pushed Ukrainianization policies even further by changing many Russian newspapers to Ukrainian and requiring all officials to know Ukrainian or be dismissed. So this Ukrainianization process is still continuing during the transition period. Now, while Ukrainian Communist Party leaders, like Skripnik, were still above criticism for supporting the policy of Ukrainianization, their opponents within the Communist Party Bolshevik of Ukraine now had to direct their attention elsewhere to non-communist intelligentsia. Already in July 1929, mass arrests, some estimates are as high as 5,000, were made of people who were accused of belonging to allegedly underground subversive organizations. In the spring of 1930, 45 persons were put on trial for anti-state activity. All but 9 of them were sentenced to prison terms. This first political trial in 1930 became a convenient means. These were the famous show trials. You have a trial not because of who's going to be accused, but what's the purpose of it? What message is one going to send? And the message here was to point out that contacts with the West, and especially Ukrainian emigres, should stop, and that any attacks against the government's approach to industrialization and collectivization also should end. Bourgeois nationalism, another one of these great phrases of the Soviets. Nationalism was bad because it was associated with mini-capitalists, so now we have bourgeois nationalism as being the greatest threat and danger to Ukrainian society. Just as any peasant became a counter-revolutionary kulak if he or she did not agree with collectivization and forced grain requisitions, and now so too did every intellectual become a counter-revolutionary bourgeois nationalist if he or she did not favor the party's, albeit changing, approach to the nationality question. And armed now with the perception that bourgeois nationalism is equatable to being an enemy of the people, between 1931 and 1934, the leading lights of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, whether or not they were communists, were removed from their positions, often arrested, imprisoned, exiled, and many eventually executed. This included scholars like Hrushevsky, who was exiled, linguists who were working on this Ukrainian dictionary, a whole host of writers. And then by 1933, it was time to turn directly to the party hierarchy. The Communist Party Bolshevik of Ukraine itself. Already by October 1935, 75% of the officials in local Soviets and 80% of local party secretaries were dismissed. Overall party membership declined. So in June 1932, 520,000. October 1933, 470,000. Why were these problems? There has to be a reason for this. Well, you need a scapegoat. And who was the scapegoat? This Mykola Skripnik, the Commissar of Education, who, according to his comrades in the party, had filled his ministry with quote-unquote hostile, counter-revolutionary nationalist elements. Rather than recant his wrongdoings, and as many those who were accused did, Skripnik committed suicide in July 1933. And so by 1934, it seemed that the most serious dangers on the agrarian and intellectual front were taken care of, whether by arrest, imprisonment, executions, or mass starvation. At the same time, as part of the centralization and regimentation imposed on Soviet society during the 1930s, greater emphasis was given to Russian culture, and in particular the Russian language. After all, that was the language considered the medium through which the world's first socialist state was created. The Russian language was now equated with survival in the only world which the future promised, a communist society according to the dictates of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. And so, in just 2 decades, during this interwar period, the communists had come full circle in Ukraine. They had begun back in 1919, 1920, with an attempt to create an international socialist society without any national distinctions, expressed only in Russian. Now in 1939, they were right back where they started. After all, Ukrainianization, like the economic experiment of the new economic policy, was never more than a temporary solution. The proverbial one step backward had been made. The giant leap forward was now possible. The year was 1939, however. New clouds hovered over Europe, and before long, war was to engulf most parts of the world. As a result, Soviet leaders were going to have to take more step backwards than even the ultimate pragmatist himself, Lenin, would have ever dreamed necessary.